Hey everyone, and welcome back as I discuss episode 3 of season 3 of his Dark Materials, The Intention Craft. In this episode, Lyra's dreams about Roger in the Land of the Dead continue. There's also some foreshadowing that Pan will not be able to go with Lyra, and Lyra is keeping this information from him, or this intuition. At Asriel's headquarters, Mrs. Coulter is being held a prisoner with the Golden Monkey. It looks like she's being held in some kind of dark shipping container. Asriel wants to talk to her, find out what she's been up to, and this is the first time that we've seen the two together since the very end of season 1 when they were on the mountaintop and Asriel invited Mrs. Coulter to go with him into the new world. So a lot of tension to be expected here. Mrs. Coulter and Asriel have a conversation about what Mrs. Coulter had been doing with Lyra. Mrs. Coulter is very determined to convince Asriel that Lyra is incredibly special, that she is worth all the effort that she went to keep her safe, and that Asriel really needs to direct his attention to Lyra as well. Asriel is still not having any of this, but he does let Mrs. Coulter know that he has his own agent, Lady Salmakia, with Lyra, and they are keeping tabs on the situation. And speaking of Lady Salmakia, she managed to slip through the opening that Will and Lyra had used to escape into their safe world, and she is kind of lurking around the kids. Will and Lyra catch up on all the things that they've missed, and Will tells Lyra that the knife is broken. Will also gives Lyra her alethiometer back. He's been carding it all this time since Lyra was kidnapped. Lyra has an idea that Iorek can fix the knife. She knows that he is an amazing ironsmith. If anyone's up for the job, it's him. The two kids do not agree though on what they should be doing with the knife if it is ever fixed. Will is very sure that he needs to fulfill his promise to his dad, go to Lord Asriel with the knife and kind of serve the rebellious agenda there, while Lyra is very sure that she needs to attend to this message from Roger, go to the Land of the Dead and help him however she can, since she really feels that it is her fault that Roger is dead. Lyra, unsurprisingly for her, is being a bit of a brat, and Pan is the one who finally prods her into apologizing to Will. He's come all of this way to help her. He's gone to great lengths to rescue her from the clutches of Mrs. Coulter, and she hasn't been extremely grateful to him. She's certainly been sassing him about their future agenda. Ultimately, the kids decide that before they can make any next steps, they need to fix the knife, and they will go to Iorek to ask him to do that. Lady Salmakia is hearing all of this. She, of course, wants Will to use the knife for Asriel, and her intention was to make sure the kids were safe and then bring them back to Asriel HQ. Since the knife is broken, they're kind of worthless to her at this point, but with the idea that the knife might be fixed, she knows that she needs to stay with them and keep things as contained and managed as possible. There is some conflict here, and Will and Lyra in the book are quite a bit more dishonest and a bit sneaky with the Gallivespians. In the show, we only have Lady Salmakia, but she's definitely keeping tabs on the kids and using the lodestone resonator that we saw in the last episode to communicate with Asriel. On their way to find Iorek, the kids go back to Fair Isle and they visit the chapel that Mrs. Coulter had been keeping Lyra asleep and drugged in. And Lyra tells Will that she woke up a few times during her drugged fever haze and Mrs. Coulter was holding her. This is kind of a very complicated realization for Lyra because she tells Will she never had been held before in her life, and she thinks that Mrs. Coulter really did care in a way. We see some sadness, some tenderness, and some really fraught feelings on Lyra's part. Asriel decides to introduce Mrs. Coulter to his ward council and ask them what they think about Mrs. Coulter potentially joining that council. This meeting goes off the rails in many ways and was a delight for me to watch. Asriel seems incredibly amused by this, also quite unsurprised and potentially a little bit charmed, but some of the other members are a bit less interested in entertaining the idea of working with Mrs. Coulter. Ruta in particular is quite pissed since Mrs. Coulter has tormented and tortured and probably killed quite a few witches along the way. Mrs. Coulter, of course, knows what feelings are coming up for the others, and she tries to head them off by doing the classic, "I will admit to all the bad things before you can accuse me of them." She says, "You cannot exact a harsher judgment than the judgment I've placed on myself." I thought this was like such a brilliant and hilarious way to kind of redirect, displace, interrupt the ridicule that she might be receiving. Mrs. Coulter also tries to turn the tables, saying that she certainly is a great asset to them, but the only reason she might even entertain the possibility of helping them is because she believes that they might protect Lyra. She's not sure that she wants to work with them. Forget about whether they actually want to work with her. She peppers in a lot of self-flagellation, saying things like, "I've been the worst mother in the world," and really summoning her drama skills to supplicate in the face of these other humans. In that kind of same vein, Mrs. Coulter talks about the humiliation of Lyra's birth, and I think her point here is quite legitimate, and we don't pay enough attention to it throughout the series. She mentions that not only did she have this child illegitimately, she had that child with a man, Lord Asriel, who fucking murdered her husband, Mr. Coulter. We never meet Mr. Coulter, and we don't really know much about him until we get to the Book of Dust, Part 1, but Mrs. Coulter has had to carry this social stigma while Lord Asriel has, for the most part, gotten off just being a devil-may-care, kind of easygoing, responsibility-free dude. Mrs. Coulter also notes that she has saved Lyra from the oblation board and their knife, which is particularly rich considering she created the knife and the oblation board was hers. In the end, the War Council decides to keep Mrs. Coulter, though many of the members are quite suspicious. Lord Roke says that he does not trust Mrs. Coulter and will keep an eye on her. And Commander Ogunwe makes an interesting point and says that he doesn't trust Asriel around Mrs. Coulter. Asriel tries to placate these doubts and says that if there's any sign that Mrs. Coulter is trying to flee or betray them, she will die. Once the kids leave the chapel, they find Iorek not very far away, eating some kind of marine mammal. They explain to Iorek that the knife has broken, and they tell him how that happened, and they ask Iorek, Lyra asks Iorek, if he can fix the knife. He is very deeply troubled by the idea of fixing the knife and the knife itself, and he says that he really thinks the knife should have never been made. He asks Will if Will can see the very tip of the knife, and Will says no, honestly, and he points to that to explain that the knife has intentions that the knife bearer probably doesn't know about, and without being able to see every tiny bit of the knife, including the tip, we can't predict exactly what the knife does when it's being used. Iorek also asks what they want to do with the knife, and Lyra tells him that she wants to go to the land of the dead to meet Roger and to help free him or help him however she can. He is not okay with the idea that Lyra wants to go to the land of the dead. He explains that bears don't have ghosts, so that if Lyra dies and stays in the land of the dead, they won't be able to see each other again. Lyra somehow convinces him that she will ask the alethiometer to find out if this is the right thing to do. She does use the alethiometer to ask, and she confesses that she's never seen it so confused, but in the end, the answer was yes. She kind of rushes through that point. Iorek knows that the alethiometer can't lie. They've certainly talked about it before, so he agrees to fix it, though he seems still quite skeptical. In the show, we get an abbreviated version of the mending of the subtle knife. In the book, all three of the characters, Lyra, Will, and Iorek, are extremely involved in the process, and it seems like Philip Pullman probably did some research on metalsmithing. We don't get all of that, which is fine in the show. Though we do find out that Will is just as responsible for mending the knife as Iorek, and that it's his mind and his connection to the knife that really finishes the process and makes it successful. The effort that it takes to mend the knife is quite great, and Will passes out as soon as he's finished. He wakes up with Lyra and Iorek staring at him from above, wondering what has happened. Now that the knife is mended, it's clear that the kids have some decisions to make. and it's clear that Iorek will need to do something himself to survive. It is time to part ways. We see another very heartfelt, emotional goodbye between Iorek and Lyra, and it seems as though, considering that Lyra is going to the land of the dead, or at least she intends to, it might be a final goodbye. We don't know if they will see each other again. Iorek tells them both that they are welcome on Svalbard. He also tells the kids that they deserve each other, that they are two equals, and they're a good match. I'm not gonna lie, this moment when Iorek tells them that they deserve each other was really impactful for me when I read this book as a teenager. I thought, I want to find a partner who Iorek Byrnison would think would be an equal partner for me. That is going to be my goal in life. I have a bit of a non sequitur. I should have actually talked about this in the first episode of the season, but my mind was elsewhere, so apologies. But I wanted to talk about a scene that is missing from this season. It would have been, again, the first episode that is in the book that I absolutely loved. I'm not exactly surprised that they didn't include it, but I think it's worth talking about. And that is the scene where Iorek Byrnison finds Lee Scoresby's preserved body that Serafina has left for him. In the book, when Lee dies and Serafina finds him too late, she does a spell to preserve his body so that when Iorek Byrnison finally catches up with him, he can say his last goodbyes. And in the book, Iorek Byrnison does this, finds Lee, and fucking eats Lee. He says that the road ahead is long, and he will do Lee Scoresby the final honor of using his body to nourish Iorek, and that the blood in Lee's body will keep Iorek's sense of vengeance alive, or his desire for revenge. When I read this book, as I'm sure many people did, my heart was unsure how to feel about that. Of course, cannibalism, whether this is cannibalism or not, it's probably not, since Iorek is not a human, he is a polar bear. But I remember talking about this scene with my thesis advisor in college, and she suggested to me that this was kind of a metaphor for communion or transubstantiation in Christianity, that, you know, when you're in church, you have the body and blood of Christ in the form of the wafer and the wine that you drink when you receive communion. And that this was kind of similar to that Lee's body was imbuing Iorek with the qualities that Lee had as a human that would then somehow pass to Iorek. Fascinating idea. I can see that this would probably be very icky for a lot of viewers, and that might have been a little bit too controversial for the show, but I thought it was worth talking about, and I would love to hear anyone else's opinions about that scene in the book. Are you glad that they left it out? Would you have liked to have seen it? What do you think about it? Any and all thoughts about it are very welcome. At this point, we see Balthamos again. He comes back to Will to check in on what's happening, asking Will if he can take Will to Lord Asriel with the knife now that it's mended. But Will makes a decision that rather than following that request from his dad, he will accompany Lyra to the land of the dead to help her with her mission. Balthamos seems pretty understanding of this and agrees that Will has to do what he has to do. Will invites Balthamos to go with them to the land of the dead, and Balthamos says that angels cannot go to the land of the dead. Pan seems incredibly apprehensive about this. We have a feeling that demons and angels are both made of dust, so interesting. Fast forwarding a bit to the end of the episode for clarity's sake, Will uses his knife, now whole again of course, to cut into the land of the dead, and we get our first glimpses. Pan, who is shaped as an adorable Arctic fox, is beyond reluctant about this and is freaking out. Back in Geneva at Magisterium headquarters, Father MacPhail, Father President, has been up to some stuff. He's not just wearing purple robes and praying in frescoed chapels, he has things to do. Father MacPhail summons Dr. Cooper, who we will recognize as the lead scientist at Bolvangar, and we see that Bolvangar did not leave her unscathed. If we remember, there was a massive fire that Lyra herself started, and Dr. Cooper is looking a bit worse for wear. Father McPhail tells Dr. Cooper that the work she did with Mrs. Coulter at Bolvangar was a quote-unquote moral and religious disaster, but there is a great opportunity for Dr. Cooper to redeem herself here. He wants her to focus that tremendous energy field created when a human and their demon are severed into something like a bomb. He wants to use that energy as a weapon, and he wants her to figure out how the fuck they can do that quickly and effectively. If moral redemption isn't motivating enough, surprise, they're keeping both her and her team captive until she gets the job done. So there's that. In Azrael's world, where his headquarters are, Mrs. Coulter is skulking around the intention craft schematics and then the actual machine itself. She is clearly interested in the intention craft and perhaps looking for a way to use it. In any case, when she is physically around the intention craft, she is discovered by Lord Asriel, who catches her in a lie. He hears from Lord Roke, the Gallivespian, who hears from Lady Salmakia, who's with the kids, that the knife has been mended and that the knife exists at all. Mrs. Coulter had denied that there had been a knife, and so this is a preliminary sign that she is not being super honest with the team. In what seems like a perhaps petty move, Asriel tells Mrs. Coulter that he has pulled Lady Salmakia away from the kids and recalled her back to her post so that she can be dispatched elsewhere. Mrs. Coulter does not take this well. She's convinced that Lyra needs all the protection that she can get, and the two get into an impassioned argument, as seems par for the course for them. As Mrs. Coulter is talking about how Lyra needs these resources, she needs their attention, she needs to be protected, Asriel kind of blows up at Mrs. Coulter and says that he has risked way too much, he's poured too much of himself into this project to divert his attention and energies to their child instead. Asriel unleashes some real bitterness here, and he calls Mrs. Coulter a pitiless, power-hungry agent of the church who only loves Lyra, an arrogant, foul-mouthed brat with dirt under her fingernails. And he says that she settles her feathers on Lyra like a mother hen plucking over her. He seems to focus on the fact that Mrs. Coulter can love Lyra, and there's something that goes unsaid between them, but it is quite clear that what he is not saying is that Mrs. Coulter can't quite seem to love him. Mrs. Coulter doesn't take kindly to any of this, and she spits on Asriel's face, and when she does this, Lord Asriel attacks her, choking her, holding her up against the intention craft, and they're both very emotionally distraught. Again, the question from season 1 of, is this love, comes to mind. The two are wrapped so tightly in themselves, but also in each other, that this kind of physical, toxic, abusive relationship is what is spilling out. As Asriel is choking Mrs. Coulter with tears in his eyes, he says, "Why can't you just be who I want you to be?" Classic narcissist question from a classic narcissist to another classic narcissist. After releasing his hold on her throat, Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter kind of settle next to each other, and the two of them have a much calmer conversation. To me, it seemed like this was another attempt to hurt Mrs. Coulter, but Lord Asriel shares with Mrs. Coulter that the authority is a sham and that she has spent her life working for a lie, that all of her faith, that all of her efforts, that her career has been basically for naught. And Mrs. Coulter does not believe him. She thinks, this is bullshit. There's no way this could be true. But he tells Mrs. Coulter that the authority is not actually ruling at this point. The authority has a regent who rules in his stead. He tells her that the creator is an angel rather than a god. He says, "Every hideous thing you've ever done in his name, and it was all a lie." Mrs. Coulter is visibly shaken by this, and I think it dawns on her that there could be some truth. In order to prove himself and to kind of rub this in her face further, but also to show off, Lord Asriel takes Mrs. Coulter to Alarbus so that she can meet an angel from the Authority and recognize, how cool the rebellion is and how many resources he has. Definitely an attempt at exuding some big dick energy. Asriel announces to Mrs. Coulter and to Alarbus himself, actually, that he is going to use Mrs. Coulter's demon cutting severing technology to destroy Alarbus, to tear him into tiny, tiny pieces and blast him back to the Authority. We see a shade of his dwindling moral compass when he says, "I do not do this willingly. I do this because you forced my hand." Again, we get the sense that he's willing to go to whatever lengths he has to achieve his end, to win this rebellion. As he starts to amp up the machine that he's using, Mrs. Coulter's technology, we get the sense that even Mrs. Coulter, who is no stranger to torture, to hurting people, to doing every evil deed there is, she looks fucking appalled by this. But Mrs. Coulter is smart, and she lets Lord Asriel be distracted by this venture, sending her golden monkey demon out of the room. As Asriel reaches this peak angel destruction moment, he looks back to see Mrs. Coulter, and he realizes that she is gone. She has left this angel torture chamber to find the intention craft, which the golden monkey has already discovered and has gotten ready for her, and she is headed the fuck out. They chase Mrs. Coulter, finding her leaving in the intention craft, and Asriel and Ogunwe and all of Asriel's soldiers are about to shoot her down when Asriel makes a split decision of no, let her go, but Lord Roke, go with her to see where she goes, and maybe we can use this as an opportunity. And we see her flying off into the sunset. So a lot has happened in this episode. We have the mending of the knife. We have a goodbye between Lyra and Iorek. We have a decision that the kids will go to the land of the dead to rescue Roger. We have the reunion of Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel. We have the extreme torture and destruction, potentially, of an angel. And then we have Mrs. Coulter leaving Asriel HQ. Where she will go, we don't know just yet. Everyone is on the move. Also Mary, she's somewhere doing something, following the I Ching, traveling through the worlds. Thank you again so much for watching, and join me for episode 4. Thanks.